Welcome to Environmental Intelligence, Episode 24, recorded for April 15th, 2026. This briefing distills the regulatory, scientific, and commercial signals that actually move budgets, timelines, and liability exposure for contaminated sites practitioners, remediation engineers, and environmental counsel across Canada. Over the next 10 to 13 minutes, we'll move from immediate British Columbia political risk through grid-scale decarbonization pressures, cross-border regulatory developments, emerging methane science, and finally into the practical forensic adjustments required when you're standing on yet another heterogeneous glacial till site in the GTA or Lower Mainland. Every item is framed so you can decide this week whether to adjust a work plan, update a client brief, or simply keep watching. Let's begin in British Columbia, where the NDP minority government has temporarily withdrawn proposed amendments to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA, rather than risk defeat on a confidence vote. The decision follows weeks of mounting opposition from industry and some rural caucus members who argued that the original wording would have tightened consent requirements on provincial environmental assessments, Environmental Management Act, EMA permits, and decisions involving Schedule 2 and 3 contaminated sites under the Contaminated Sites Regulation (CSR). Premier Eby has been careful to signal that core sections still require a pause for further consultation on implementation mechanics, particularly around project approvals and land use planning where Indigenous rights overlap with remediation liabilities. For contaminated sites professionals, the withdrawal buys breathing room. The current DRIPA framework continues to govern the level of consultation and accommodation expected on Crown land projects, EMA discharge permits, and risk-based CSR approvals. Phase 2 and Phase 3 environmental site assessments, detailed quantitative risk assessments, and remedial action plans that intersect with asserted Aboriginal rights or title can therefore proceed under the existing procedural expectations rather than under a suddenly tightened consent test. That stability is worth real money. It protects project timelines that were already baked into financing models and avoids the immediate need to resequence consultation budgets or retain additional Indigenous legal counsel. Still, the minority government math has not changed. Practitioners should maintain a watching brief on the legislature. Any reintroduced language could compress regulatory review windows under the EMA and alter the sequencing of CSR applications on sites with potential rights implications. The practical takeaway is continuity for the next several weeks at minimum. Your current DRIPA-informed consultation timelines on EMA permits and CSR submissions remain the correct baseline until further notice. Build that into your April and May forecasts and flag it for clients who are modeling closure costs on remote or brownfield redevelopment projects. That pause in Victoria sits against a larger national conversation about clean energy infrastructure. Several clean energy alliances and utilities are intensifying calls for deliberate east-west electricity transmission interconnections to knit provincial grids together and accelerate renewable integration. The push is driven by the recognition that decarbonization targets in provincial climate plans, federal clean electricity regulations, and corporate net zero commitments cannot be met efficiently if surplus hydroelectric power in British Columbia and Quebec cannot reach load centers or industrial facilities in the prairies and Ontario without looping through the United States. For consultants and engineers supporting oil sands closure, mining remediation, or large-scale contaminated sites projects, enhanced interprovincial transmission has direct cash flow implications. Greater grid reliability and lower long-run marginal power costs can materially improve the net present value of energy-intensive remedial technologies such as electrical resistance heating, pump and treat systems with advanced oxidation, or even soil washing operations at remote sites. The same development could expand eligibility for clean tech investment tax credits and improve the economics of carbon pricing offsets. If you are building feasibility studies or financial models this quarter for mine life extension, tailings remediation, or industrial brownfield redevelopment, you should now be running at least one scenario that assumes incremental east-west transmission capacity comes online inside the next planning horizon. The signal is no longer theoretical, it is entering project economics. South of the border, the US EPA has advanced a proposal that would streamline permitting for certain plastic waste recycling and recovery operations. The draft rule focuses on mechanical and advanced chemical recycling facilities, aiming to reduce administrative duplication while maintaining environmental safeguards. Although the immediate legal effect is American, Canadian practitioners tracking Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, waste provisions, provincial recycling stewardship programs, and EMA waste discharge permitting should pay close attention. Regulatory harmonization pressure frequently flows north. Changes that demonstrably accelerate safe plastic recovery in the U.S. often reappear in modified form in federal plastics registry amendments or provincial efforts to update waste management permits. Early visibility on the final U.S. rule language gives Canadian firms an opportunity to shape parallel domestic conversations before provincial regulators begin drafting. Another data set released this week adds urgency to emissions quantification work. Satellite-derived measurements show urban methane emissions rising faster than bottom-up government inventories suggest. The discrepancy matters because methane is both a potent, short-lived climate pollutant and a frequent constituent of landfill gas, fugitive emissions from contaminated sites, and legacy coal gas or oil and gas infrastructure. For practitioners preparing greenhouse gas inventories to support CSR Schedule II approvals in British Columbia, EPEA applications in Alberta, or federal facility reporting, the gap between reported and observed fluxes creates reconciliation risk during audits. The actionable response is to begin integrating satellite-derived emission factors and plume mapping products into site assessments where landfills, former gas plants, or petrochemical facilities are involved. Higher resolution baseline data reduces the likelihood of regulatory challenge and can strengthen the defensibility of your risk-based remediation endpoints. Clients who must report under emerging provincial climate disclosure rules or who face carbon pricing exposure should be advised that inventory conservatism is shifting upward. Updating templates now avoids expensive retrofits later. Two pieces of scientific literature this week, while geographically removed, carry methodological lessons for Canadian practitioners. A University of Hawaii study re-examined extinction timelines for native Hawaiian waterbirds and found no robust evidence that Indigenous hunting was the primary driver. Instead, the data point to a combination of pre- and post-contact climate variability, invasive species, and habitat conversion. The parallel for Canadian work is clear. Species at Risk Act listing decisions and provincial risk assessments rely heavily on accurate paleo-environmental baselines. When those baselines are incomplete or politically contested, remediation endpoints, habitat offsetting ratios, and even CSR numerical standards can be challenged. The lesson is to insist on robust historical data packages before accepting a regulatory endpoint. Similarly, new tagging and tracking research on gray whales shows approximately 1 in 5 individuals that recently entered San Francisco Bay failing to survive, largely due to vessel strikes. The behavioral shift into shallower, busier waters is attributed to Arctic food web disruption linked to climate warming. For Canadian marine and coastal practitioners, the precedent is instructive. Changing species distributions must be reflected in updated marine risk assessments under the Fisheries Act and Species at Risk Act. Projects involving shipping corridors, remediation dredging, or coastal contaminated sites may face new mitigation expectations or offsetting requirements as marine mammals alter historic ranges. The takeaway is to treat baseline ecological data as dynamic, not static, especially on files with long time horizons. In the United States, officials have committed to fast-tracking a roughly $1 billion pipeline project running approximately 23 miles beneath Raritan Bay and New York Harbor. Environmental organizations continue to oppose the project on ecological and carbon lock-in grounds. Canadian pipeline and cross-border energy consultants should view the expedited federal and state approvals as a live case study in regulatory streamlining. Similar procedural techniques, early issue identification, coordinated permitting timetables, and targeted environmental impact statements frequently inform Impact Assessment Act implementation and the work of the Canada Energy Regulator on projects with transboundary implications. Watching how the U.S. balances speed against litigation risk provides practical intelligence for Canadian proponents facing their own schedule pressures. Research also documented a 160% increase in data center carbon emissions over the last several years, with Microsoft's multi-billion-dollar partnership with oil and gas interests cited as one factor pulling hyperscalers off earlier decarbonization pathways. For remediation firms and consultants supporting technology sector clients, the implications are immediate. Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions reporting under provincial climate disclosure legislation and federal carbon pricing mechanisms is becoming both more material and more scrutinized. Energy and emissions forecasts inside ESG due diligence packages and site redevelopment plans should be refreshed to reflect higher baseline grid intensities and slower renewable procurement trajectories. Clients contemplating data center adjacent brownfield redevelopment or hyperscale campus remediation need updated cost curves now, not after the next compliance filing. On a more encouraging note, Japan recorded its lowest annual greenhouse gas emissions in fiscal year 2024. The outcome reflects decades of consistent policy, technology deployment, and industrial restructuring in a jurisdiction whose demographic, urban, and manufacturing profile shares meaningful similarities with parts of Canada. Practitioners advising on international benchmarking or corporate net zero strategies should incorporate the Japanese data when evaluating best available techniques for Canadian facilities seeking EMA permits or federal carbon pricing compliance. The numbers provide a credible peer economy reference point when clients ask what leading performance actually looks like. Finally, let's bring this back to the field. You arrive at a former urban gas station or dry cleaning site in the Greater Toronto Area or Lower Mainland. The Phase 2 ESA reveals tetrachloroethylene or benzene concentrations exceeding standards in one monitoring well, but not in an adjacent well only 8 meters away, despite clear evidence of a point source. What you are observing is classic heterogeneous transport in glacial till and outwash deposits that dominate large swaths of Ontario, the prairies, and British Columbia. These soils contain high permeability sand and gravel lenses encased in low permeability silt and clay matrices, creating preferential pathways that can move dissolved phase contaminants tens of meters while leaving adjacent soil volumes largely clean. Under BCCSR Protocol 4 or Ontario's sampling and analysis requirements, a handful of monitoring wells will almost never capture true plume geometry. Experienced consultants respond by increasing temporary point sampling density. Geoprobe transects run perpendicular to inferred groundwater flow, membrane interface probe, or laser-induced fluorescence logging to map permeability contrasts before locking in permanent well locations. Regulatory reviewers are increasingly requesting these higher resolution datasets when non-uniformity affects delineation or risk assessment conclusions. The most common and costly mistake is assuming one or two representative wells adequately define source zone and plume boundaries. That assumption leads to underdesigned remedial systems, rejected CSR applications, or expensive supplemental delineation after regulatory pushback. The fix is straightforward and should be treated as standard operating procedure. Treat every glacial soil site as heterogeneous by default. Make stratigraphic control the primary objective of the intrusive investigation. Use the resulting permeability map to locate monitoring points, design injection arrays for in situ chemical oxidation or permeable reactive barriers, and defend your conceptual site model with data rather than assumptions. Clients and regulators alike respect that rigor. It protects both project economics and professional reputation. Before we close, here are the immediate calendar markers that should sit on your desk. April 22nd marks the beginning of federal budget implementation monitoring for any new contaminated sites funding envelopes or carbon pricing adjustments. April 30th is the typical provincial deadline window for first quarter groundwater monitoring reports on Schedule 2, CSR, and EPEA approved sites. The expected window for retabling of British Columbia DRIPA related language, should the minority government stabilize, falls between May 1st and May 15th. CCM, E-guideline review cycles for soil vapor intrusion and PFAS remain active. Watch the Canada Gazette for new 30-day comment periods. And keep an eye on any near-term movement on federal clean electricity regulations that could intersect with the East-West grid discussion. If you are working on sites with potential Indigenous rights overlaps in British Columbia, confirm that your DRIPA consultation protocols remain aligned with upcoming EMA permit applications or CSR submissions. Update project carbon accounting templates to incorporate satellite-derived methane factors where landfill gas or fugitive emissions contribute. Brief clients on possible east-west grid developments and their effect on long-term power cost assumptions for remote mine remediation or oil sands closure. And schedule additional high-resolution sampling for any Phase 2 ESA in glacial terrain that shows non-uniform contaminant distribution on first pass. Track the US EPA plastic recycling rule for early signals of CEPA alignment. That's Environmental Intelligence for April 15th, 2026. If this briefing saves you time or sharpens a decision, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive and compliant day. 872. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy and I hope others do as well.